Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today, we're going to be talking about the work of the Wilson Center's Africa program's Sudans Working Group. Let me introduce you to our guest. Oge Onubogu is the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. And we have two ambassadors with us, Ambassador Nureldin Satti and Ambassador Donald Booth, who are co-chairs of that working group. A little more about both. Ambassador Satti is a retired UN senior official who previously served as Sudan's ambassador to the United States, also to France, Portugal, Switzerland, and the Vatican. And Ambassador Booth served as U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan, and was also U.S. Ambassador to the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the Republic of Zambia, and the Republic of Liberia. And as I mentioned, they are co-chairing the Sudans Working Group. And Oge, I thought it would be good for our viewers and listeners if we began with a little background on the group. If you could talk to us about how it was formed, why it was formed, and what it's intended to do.
Thank you very much, and thanks for hosting this conversation. So the Sudan's Working Group was actually established in 2009, and it was established to engage U.S., African, and international policymakers and stakeholders in forward-leaning policy dialogues aimed at advancing the prospects for peace, security, and development between Sudan and South Sudan. In fact, both Ambassador Satti and Ambassador Booth were also initial members of the Sudan's Working Group in 2009. So they will also be able to provide some more information about sort of the thinking and what was happening in Sudan-US relations at that time that actually informed the creation of the working group. So since 2009, the Sudan's Working Group has really served as a space for key stakeholders from the US, Africa, and the international community to really share analysis and their perspectives, and also provide different policy options to help address some of the critical issues related to both Sudan and South Sudan. Stop it there.
Okay, thanks. And so you've teed that up. So, gentlemen, if you could take us back to the original year before Oge's time on the job here at Wilson, and talk about the formative years and how you decided on how you would recruit the discussants who would be part of the various discussions that you conducted at the group. Give us some insight into how that went and what the buy-in was initially.
Well, if you allow me, well, the idea actually came out in early 2009 when the late Howard Wolpe and Steve McDonald were in charge of the Africa program. And initially, the co-chairs were Ambassador Alan Goolsey and myself. And the idea came at a time when Sudan was one, actually. Just before the independence of South Sudan. And it was a critical moment, actually, at that time, when, negotiations were, had taken place. The CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, was signed, in Kenya. Implementation was well ahead, but very complex issues were rising about preparing for the referendum was to take place, a couple of years later on, and the independence that has taken place. And the idea was to bring around all of those who are, interested in Sudan, concerned and engaged in the issue of Sudan in Washington and around the world, actually. But the initial idea was to get all those who are concerned directly, whether the State Department, Congress, State, White House, universities, NGOs, personalities, academicians concerned about Sudan and working on Sudan. So that was the initial idea, and how it became to be.
Ambassador Satti, and I thank you for mentioning our dear and dearly departed colleagues, Howard Wolpe and Steve McDonald, two terrific professionals, but also just great human beings, and we miss them dearly. Ambassador Booth, then talk about how you became involved and expand more on what some of the focus of the group has been.
Well, I became co-chair with Ambassador Satti about 2 years ago. And we initially, one of our first activities actually was when Sudan was still somewhat at peace, it was after the military coup, but there was functioning unity government. We've initially focused on the issue of Abyei, which is a territory that has been disputed between Sudan and South Sudan for really since before the South Sudan independence referendum. However, with the developments in Sudan, the war starting in April of last year, we shifted our focus to really addressing the conflict there. And we initiated a four-part series trying to bring out and enhance the voices of Sudanese civilians, including grassroots civilians, not just elites and political parties, into the dialogue about how to convince the generals to stop fighting, how to address future political negotiations, security sector reform, issues that are absolutely critical if Sudan is to have peace restored. So we have conducted those four workshops. We've invited policymakers in Washington, as well as others that Ambassador Satti mentioned, from the NGO community, think tanks, et cetera. And I think we've made some important contributions in terms of the policy recommendations that have come out of those discussions.
Where do you, when you've had the four working groups or the four focuses, when those recommendations are created, who are they shared with and how are they distributed?
Well, we have drafted policy papers as a result of those, and they are, of course, on the Woodrow Wilson website. And as a co-chair, I have taken the opportunity to share it with others in the U.S. government that I know, to try to make sure that it is being read and considered.
Okay, a lot of groups like this, I shouldn't say a lot of groups like this because there aren't a lot like this. We wish we had more. But groups that talk about involving civilians, involving the people who are most affected by the issues that are being discussed and debated, often easier said than done. What has been the experience of this group, and how do you enlist the civilians who participate in the discussions?
Well, thank you for that question. I think the longevity of the Sudan's Working Group at the Wilson Center and just the credibility that this group has, knowing that this has been around since 2009, and also with our co-chairs too as well, with the networks and connections that we have, not only within the U.S. government, but most importantly, within the Sudanese community as well, those who are resident on the continent and also the diaspora. And the fact that these conversations have been ongoing for several years, I think it has also helped to build the credibility of the Sudan's Working Group at the Wilson Center. Now, there are various other Sudan's Working Groups or other groups within the Washington, D.C. area and elsewhere that are also working on Sudan and working on these issues. And one of the good things that we've done at Wilson is that we've also found ways to collaborate with them too as well, to ensure that even as they work with their own partners, that the recommendations that are produced by those who participate in the Wilson Working Group conversations also shared with a broader network. I think, as you rightfully mentioned, we need more people, we need more organizations working on issues like these. So it's really important for us to collaborate. And that's one of the things that the Wilson Center, Sudan's Working Group does very well, collaborating with others, but most importantly, also serving as a convening space, as a convener, where we're able to bring together different voices, different organizations, and also building on the networks and relationships that we have built over time to ensure that we are able to drive a message and ensure that we're able to keep the message, keep our eyes on Sudan, as it were. We need more people paying attention to this issue. As Ambassador Booth has mentioned, with the civil war, the war that broke out in April of last year, we're really facing a dire situation in Sudan at this point, one of the largest, if not the largest, internal displacement crisis in the world. And it's not really getting the type of attention that it deserves.
Thanks, Oge. The gentleman, what Oge mentions, the largest displacement crisis in the world, unprecedented potential humanitarian crisis related to food security now mounting. Can you focus on some of the longer term structural and divisive conflicts that predate the current civil war, whilst in the midst of this incredible humanitarian crisis? Or is it a triage approach where, you stop the bleeding first before you can talk about some of the longer term solutions? How do you go about thinking about those two sometimes diametrically opposed goals? Longer term solutions to pre-existing problems, the immediate acute crisis. Ambassador Satti, let's begin with you, get your thoughts on that, and then we'll hear from Ambassador Booth.
Yeah, the question you are posing is one that actually that encounter many mediators around the world. The issue of sequencing, the issue of priorities, how to prioritize a solution. And my take of this is that actually you have to work on various fronts at the same time in order to resolve a conflict like the one in Sudan. While giving utmost priority to the humanitarian issue questions, you have to have in mind also what we commonly call at the end game, because you can only stop conflict in a sustainable manner if you understand exactly what are the goals and objectives of the belligerents. And what is their take of the problem, and what are their red lines, and what are the options that are open for you in order to what are the points of entry into the conflict. So to answer your question, yes, of course, we need to give utmost priority to humanitarian situation, but while doing that, we also need to look at the possible options that are open to us in order to convince the belligerents to accept what is yet to come and to make a solution sustainable and acceptable to belligerents and those who are supporting them, because it's much more complex. It's not only two fighting armies. These are armies that have their supporters, and they have whether on the civil front or the military front, and you have to take that into consideration.
Thanks. Ambassador Booth, your thoughts on this? It's almost the chicken and the egg conundrum, right? There, you have to really address all the things that are happening, but is there any sequencing, as described by Ambassador Satti, that makes the most sense when people are literally starving?
Well, I think we have to start with the understanding what this conflict is about. Sudan has been at war with itself since independence, with a brief period from 1972 to 1983. The first war since independence was the South. There was a brief pause for 11 years. It resumed in 1983. We had the Darfur conflict beginning in 2003, fighting in South Kordofan, Blue Nile states following that. So the problem in Sudan has been that there hasn't been a way for the political system to address the fact that it is an extremely diverse country and to embrace that diversity within the political process. So you've had the country at war with itself. Now, this latest fighting is obviously the worst. It is, I think, the world's largest humanitarian displacement crisis. The prospect of famine for hundreds of thousands of people is very real, though the UN hasn't officially declared that, but that's what most observers are saying. So you have to basically address the question of the combatants and a ceasefire at the same time that you're trying to define what the end state is, Ambassador Satti said. You have to find a way that Sudanese can live together in peace, that they can have a governance structure that will enable that. And so this is one of the things that we've been encouraging in the engagement with civilians, is to come up with that, a common approach, so that they can put that out there. And the other thing that has to happen is the external parties who are supporting the various warring factions, their interests also need to be brought into consideration and hopefully reconciled. I can't see that it is in anyone's interests internationally for Sudan to descend into chaos, for hundreds of thousands of its people to starve to death. So what are the common threads that can be brought together between what the Sudanese want and what the external actors want? Now, you need to address the external actors to stop the fighting, but you need to let the Sudanese run the process for determining their own political future.
You know, as I'm listening to and I'm jotting notes because of all the things that each of you are saying, I wrote down the term external forces, and then you introduce that into the conversation. And that can cut both ways, right? There are external forces that are part of the problem. There can also be external forces like the group that you represent that can be part of the solution. Can I get each of your thoughts on this notion of the limits of foreign intervention or foreign aid, as much as it's well intended, and how much solutions need to come from the inside for any sovereign nation? And can we get each of your thoughts on that? And maybe in the order of introduction, Oge, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. I think to the point on external actors, I think with this war that we see in Sudan, this is quite different from any conflict, or at least from past conflicts that we've seen in the country, where in the past conflicts were typically, concentrated in certain areas of the country, as we saw in the very visible Darfur crisis in Sudan. This time around, we've basically seen fights breaking out all the way from Khartoum, the center, and spreading out across the different parts of the country. So this is quite different. And we also see the two key actors that are involved in this crisis. The armed forces led by General Burhan, and then the RSF as well, led by Hemeti. So what we're seeing, as going back to the points that Ambassador Booth and Ambassador Satti have both made, is that we're basically seeing a country at war with itself. And we're seeing a breakdown of this political economic structure where for so long the center has continued to benefit from the periphery. This time around, we see groups like the RSF and other non-aligned groups that are fighting back from the periphery, fighting the center. So this is really a country at war with itself. And to the point of external actors, we see external actors in terms of countries that are either supporting one group or the other. There's visible support from the UAE going towards RSF, and then support on the other side as well to the armed forces from other actors. So this is where it becomes really complicated, because right now we're seeing the rise of middle powers basically playing a role in this crisis, and really thinking about how you bring these actors to the table, from UAE to Saudi Arabia to Turkey to Russia. These are all different actors. How do you bring them to the table as part of the discussion process? Because in many ways, some of them are actors, and some of them are actors and also spoilers too as well. How do you bring the spoilers and those that might be helping to correct the situation to the table? That's a key point in terms of the rise of the middle powers. And then from the external actors, the US, the Brits, the international system, the African Union, all those others who in one way or the other have vested interest to ensure that there is peace and stability, bringing those actors to the table will be important. Now, there have been several ceasefire attempts with this crisis, and we've seen very little progress. I think one of the things that we try to remind people just in the peace building process and the conflict resolution process, a failed ceasefire shouldn't be seen as, closing the door. A failed ceasefire process should be an opportunity for learning lessons. A failed ceasefire process should be an opportunity for us to go back to the drawing board, to really rethink and ask ourselves who are the right partners, who are the right individuals that should be at the table, and how can we really make a role for civilians. I think for so long in the process, we haven't seen an effective role for civilians in this process. How do we ensure that civilian voices are engaged in the process? I think this is a question that has been on the table for quite some time now. So I will leave it there at that.
Thank you. Gentlemen, as we continue this discussion about the role of external actors or forces, perhaps as each of you make your comments, you could also think in terms of what would be most helpful in terms of recommendations. What can external forces do? And then perhaps the other side of that coin, identifying those that are instigators or troublemakers that need to be dealt with if there's going to be a solution found. Ambassador Satti, you're up.
Yeah, well, as Oge said, actually there are many hands, in this problem of Sudan. Much is at stake. It's about democratic transition. It's about civilian rule. It's about the role of the military in politics. It's about resources. It's about geostrategic interests. And that's why, as Oge rightly said, many powers are engaged in this on one side or the other. And to answer your question, it is important. That's what we have been saying since the beginning. The external actors have to align their thinking about what they want to do in Sudan. But we know that it's, this is not an easy thing to do, bearing in mind the conflict of interest that exists around Sudan, and that we are in a particular moment in history where the issue of middle powers has come, into the picture. The disagreement or the conflicting, ideas about what to do, not only with Sudan, but actually the whole Horn of Africa, Red Sea security, and wider world security also as reflected in that area. And the struggle that we have, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's with the Houthis in Yemen, and all that, and all these things, interacting together and giving us a very complex picture. But to answer your question, the way we see it, that on the civilian side, we have been trying to put our acts together. I think we are gradually getting somewhere now. And what we have always been saying since the beginning is that this is a political question that can only be resolved through political means, and which gives us, we civilians, a role to play in this conflict. And we are calling on the regional powers and international powers, and African Union, IGAD, the Jeddah process, the international actors who are interested in the case of Sudan, the neighbors of Sudan, to put their acts together in order to be able to help Sudan to move forward. We see now that things are moving more or less in the right direction. We see the Egyptians now involved by the Cairo, meeting that took place a few days ago. The African Union getting its act together now, getting the Sudanese to get together also in a few days. I understand that there's going to be a meeting of mediators in Djibouti that would take place in about 3 or 4 days. And the first time all mediators meet together in order to see how they can work together. All those efforts, we hope that will produce a result that would help us move forward.
Thanks. Ambassador Booth.
Well, I agree with Ambassador Satti. I mean, you need to have some unity of effort among the various players that have been trying to mediate this conflict. One of the worst things that can happen in any peace negotiation process is to have forum shopping. So that's an important development that all of the mediators are supposed to be getting together to discuss the way forward. That's critical. As I said earlier, it's also important to understand sort of and tease out what the core interests are of the neighbors of the other key regional players that are involved. Now, there are going to be some players that may be engaged in Sudan simply to perpetuate instability and conflict, that indeed is their interests. And they are the ones that would need to be isolated. But everybody should be given a chance to put on the table what their interests are. But most importantly is getting the Sudanese civilians who, if you don't have their backing, you're not going to have stability in Sudan. The country is going to continue to be at war. This was a point that I made when I was special envoy in 2019, trying to convince the regional states that the generals could not control Sudan. Sudan is not Egypt. 90% of the population does not live within 10 miles of the Nile River. It's a very diverse, spread out country. This is why the attempts by the Sudanese military to control rebellions in the past have failed, and why I think there will be no military solution to the current conflict. So it would be great if civilians could truly articulate a vision for both a transitional period and a political end state for Sudan and a path to getting there, that the international community, those who really want to see stability and peace return to Sudan, could get behind. So those are the critical things, the external actors, engaging them, bringing them together, and then making sure that Sudanese civilians are unified. Sudanese civilians, their disunity actually undermined the transitional government between 2019 and 2021. So it's very important that they not repeat that mistake.
A final round of questions for each of you. And I think, I realize, Ambassador Booth, that if we continue to go in the order of introduction, you always are batting cleanup and have to hear the brilliant analysis of your colleagues before you get to go. So we'll begin with you this time. We'll reverse the order. And what I want to ask is, both of you and Ambassador Satti, is, on those lists of recommendations that your group has developed, are there any things we haven't spoken about yet that haven't emerged organically? I didn't ask you to list them in any kind of linear fashion, and we've talked about a lot during our time, but are there any things that we haven't touched on yet that you think are critical to the discussion that you'd like to bring up?
Well, there are two key issues. One, we actually had an entire session about, which is security sector reform. The current conflict, the approximate cause of kicking off the fighting last April was disagreement about security sector reform, how long it would take to integrate the SAF and the rapid support forces. So civilian involvement in security sector reform is absolutely essential, because in effect, you have to have a national security strategy. That's what drives what your security forces are and how much of your national budget you're providing to them. The other issue, and I think this is one that needs to be considered more, is the role of the military in the economy. This is something that I think is a problem in many countries, where longstanding military, strong militaries have woven themselves into the economy and have basically excluded others. As a result, you have monopolies. And this is why this view that the center has kind of sucked the resources of the country and left most of the periphery of Sudan as second-class citizens. So that's another issue that will need to be addressed going forward. But again, the critical thing is the end state. What is the exit strategy for the combatants now? You have to give them a way out of this that they will find acceptable. And what they will find acceptable is a combination of what the Sudanese people are demanding, but also what they're hearing from their international backers.
Thank you. Ambassador Satti.
Yeah, of course, in addition to what Don has just said, there's this issue of the role of the military, and now we do not have one army. We have many armies, but the main belligerents are the RSF and the SAF, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. While working on the security sector reform, there are a number of issues that we took into consideration. The first one is the role. How can you bring those two to accept the fact that they are not going to play a major role or a key role or a commanding role in the transition and in the future, the constitutional future of Sudan? And this is an issue that is really now being debated, The second issue is the link to that is the issue of transitional justice, of the issue of accountability, how to address accountability in a context like the Sudanese one. Many crimes have been committed, not only during this war, but since independence, crimes have been committed. So how are we going to deal with the issue of accountability while at the same time trying to convince the belligerents to play a constructive role in what's going to happen in the future? Another open question in the Sudanese case is that of the diversity, Sudanese diversity, as mentioned by Don Booth. We have a diverse country. The regional issue has been with us for a very long time. A tug of war between the various parts of Sudan. Failure to manage that diversity has brought us to this situation. How are we going to manage that diversity from a political and constitutional point of view, and what kind of constitution we can work together to create for a Sudanese state? So these are a set of issues that are we need, to reflect on, and in order to bring those who are fighting the two belligerents to accept certain, resolutions that will be taken within what we call now Sudanese inclusive dialogue that would include everybody, but while at the same time seeing to it that spoilers are not part of this game.
Thank you, Ambassador Satti. Oge, you get the last word, and if you would, give us a sense of what's next. What's next for the working group? What's next for the Africa program's continued focus on Sudan and South Sudan?
Thank you very much. And I think, just to pick up on what the two co-chairs have already outlined over here in terms of some of the recommendations that have come that are listed in the policy briefs, which we really encourage everyone to pick up a copy and read because there's so much more in there. I think we're looking forward to think about a next step of conversations now coming from the recommendations, at least those that have been really highlighted, thinking about how we can move those forward with policymakers and with different actors, stakeholders within the US and internationally too, as well. There are some key recommendations along the parts of security sector reform, along the parts of really thinking about how we engage civilian voices, really thinking about the end game. These are key points that we saw discussed throughout our working group discussions. So we'll be looking at the next phase of moving this forward and also thinking about other examples that can be learned from elsewhere on the continent too as well, when we think about Liberia, when we think about Sierra Leone and the role that African mediators played in those conflicts, really think about how we can bring those examples to bear. I think as we move forward, we always hear about how complex the conflict is in Sudan. Things are complicated when you think about the history, but that shouldn't be an excuse. That shouldn't be an excuse for us to really prioritize what is really the world's largest internal displacement crisis. I think at this point, a few months back, we hosted a conversation with the new U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, Ambassador Perriello. And I think what came out in that conversation from the civilian actors, Sudanese civilian actors that we engaged, was that at the end of the day, people want the fighting to stop. People want to see peace in Sudan. While the avenues to get to it, there might be different views on how you achieve that peace, but at the end of the day, they want peace. And I think that in itself should be a driving force for us, that the majority want to see an end to this. And the international actors, Wilson Center, others who are working on these issues, we have to start thinking about how we bring together different actors to the table to achieve that peace. We've already looked at all the recommendations that have come out from the 4 sets of working group discussions that we've had. And moving forward, the Africa program will continue to serve as a space of convening where we bring, where we try to highlight the recommendations and bring key voices from within the administration, from the international community, and most importantly, civilian voices too as well, to move some of these recommendations forward. So definitely encourage people to continue to watch our space on with the Africa Program Sudan's Working Group. We will be updating with more information as things come together, but we're really looking forward to driving these conversations forward.
Well, I really want to thank all 3 of you. And if I'll I'll grant myself a moment to editorialize when I say that what the three of you represent in this work is the Wilson Center at its best, right? Often people think of think tanks and they think of abstractions and theoretical discussions, but you're engaged with real people in ways that can change real lives. And it's both a daunting task, but it's inspiring to see you stay at it. So thank you for today and for your ongoing work. And to Oge, the things you mentioned, if people come to the website, if you come to the wilsoncenter.org, at the top of the page, you'll find a programs tab where you can find the Africa program, and then all of these resources and more. The conversation, the event that Oge mentioned with the representative of the U.S. government is on there. Also, the policy briefs from the Sudans Working Group, all available to you as a public service. So we hope those of you who care will check it out. Thanks to all of you again today. Continued good luck in your work, and thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
To our viewers and listeners, hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for your time and your interest.